Hello, it feels like catching up with a bunch of old friends after a long summer away. I feel like the old teacher in play school looking through the magic mirror glass. But as you can see, we've got a bunch of people that got to know us last year during the lockdown, coming back to see if we can keep this thing going once we're no longer physically constrained. For anyone new, I'm Peter Lewis, my partner in crime, Catherine Murphy, is down in the pod room in the Guardian Australia Parliament House Bureau. My king geek, John Remington's joining us from Melbourne. He's back in the office, so he's back to normality. I'm still in the roof. We just thought we had so much fun talking about politics, or yabbering, as Catherine likes to call it, that we keep at least the political part of this going, and we're going to see what interest there is in other events over the course of the year. For those of you that were part of Australia at Home last year, know the idea was to set up a place where we can share ideas in a respectful way, and support each other through what was a really weird year. And I suspect this will be a pretty weird year as we come out the other end. We're all on Indigenous land. I pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognise the land we're all on was never ceded. I'm on Gadigal land. Catherine, you're down in Canberra.
Yes. I am Ngunnawal and Ngambri land here, and and this is something I should have acknowledged. I've just taken it as read, that I'd nod enthusiastically while Peter makes the acknowledgement, but I haven't really in this forum done it myself. So yeah, I am on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra, and I also pay my respects to elders past.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that normally you're in one place and you pay respects because you're there, and the idea of virtually still recognising we're on common land, I think, is a nice way of connecting everybody that's part of this Australia at Home and the political Geekfest, as we came to call it. So the purpose of this is to talk politics, to download Catherine's brain, to have a look at a little bit of our polling, which comes out every fortnight. And we're putting out the nasty poll this week, the one that we're only doing once a quarter, Catherine, which is the looking back at the horse race. So today is horse racing. But before we get into that, give us your vibe of the House. You're about to sit for the first day of 3 weeks of sitting in February, I believe.
Yeah, it's an odd configuration. Normally we're back in for a sitting fortnight, 2 weeks consecutively, but in February we're doing 3 days this week, then off for a week, then on for 2. So we're all getting our land legs, obviously, after COVID, because the sitting pattern was massively disrupted last year, as everybody I'm sure listening on today will know. But we are now, the Parliament is attempting to sort of get back into the normal sitting routine, which is there's a flurry of sort of sittings until Easter, and then there's a hiatus while everybody in the government and Treasury starts preparing the budget, and then we have the budget session. So we're trying to sort of assume normal habits, although obviously it's still all COVID safe. And the complication for this sitting was that all of the MPs and senators from Western Australia were on a special purpose flight, literally in the air, when Mark McGowan changed or sent Perth into a lockdown because of the case in Perth. So that's given the presiding officers a bit of indigestion as they've worked out how to treat the WA MPs.
It's a bit like the Australian Open of politics.
No, well, exactly. Although no one's talking about hairdressers, but yeah, it's kind of like the Australian Open of politics. So yeah, they're revving up, they're already on there. They've done their party rooms this morning. Both Labor, the caucus, and the government have had a party room meeting this morning. They've revved into the chambers. The chambers have opened with a censure motion against Craig Kelly for spreading disinformation about COVID remedies and vaccines and so on, and they're roaring into question time in about an hour. So things.
Anyone crossed the floor, or was it pretty predictable in how that played out?
The government was able to gag it as the government can, does. But all the crossbenchers voted in favour of Labor's motion, which doesn't always happen. So. Anyway, so that's the opening of the batting for the new political year.
Well, of course, the PM did the press club yesterday as well. Were you down there, and what was the takeout?
Yeah, I was there. The Prime Minister and I had a conversation about science, when it's okay and when it's optional. But yeah. Anyway, it was a solid scene setter. This Prime Ministers traditionally open the year with a speech to the National Press Club in which they identify priorities, try and project the narrative they hope will be the narrative, I guess, for the political year. It was interesting speech in this sense, and this kind of will bring us back to the poll and some of the issues we've looked at in this fortnight, Peter. But Morrison's in this sort of strange formation at the moment where he's sort of trying to make voters confident, trying to sort of project that we're doing fine with the pandemic, the economy's coming back. We've given you this fiscal support last year. Please go out and spend it because that's really beneficial to how we get to the other side of the public health crisis. But at the same time, you can't flog that message too hard because there are many variables and uncertainties, and so he's sort of got to keep the reality of the pandemic before people as well, which is that we have avoided a third wave, thank God, but will we get to the end of the year still avoiding it? Who knows, hopefully. And obviously if we think about last year being sort of COVID management as being front and centre, that sort of last year was a year of COVID politics. This year, I think vaccine politics will really dominate, and there are, this is quite tricky for Morrison and the government, because even with perfect preparedness, and the government I think was a bit slow to get itself into alignment to get reliable supply of these vaccines, but even if they had done absolutely everything perfectly, there is much of this vaccination program that is outside the government's direct control. If the Europeans are difficult about supply issues, then we will feel supply problems in Australia, at least until CSL gets up to speed. If the vaccines don't prove to be effective, then that changes the psychology of the country, I think, because a lot of people, I'm sure, on this conversation today, certainly my friends and family, everybody's hanging out, obviously, for there to be a change in the weather with this pandemic. We would like to feel safer and more certain. And if the vaccinations aren't a magic bean or, whatever, insert whatever cliche, then that changes the psychology of the country. And that's potentially difficult for the government. So anyway, it's going to be an interesting year.
Yeah, you've touched on a number of the themes that we've got in the polling this week, including vaccines and national mood. But let's start off by breaking out the crack pipe and having a look at the two-party preferred, because, we shouldn't.
Well, I'm not going to inhale. That's
So for those that haven't been familiar with our journey, for many years we put out a fortnightly two-party preferred based on the essential report, which is N equals 1,000 delivered over online panels. After 2019, we took a pause on putting that out for a bunch of reasons. And about 9 months ago to the day, we decided we'd start re-releasing the two-party preferred, but with two big changes. One was we would include the undecideds because we think they're part of the story as well. And secondly, we wouldn't put it on week by week because we think that's distorting. We'd only put it out in a 3-month series. So every 3 months, we'd look back at how the polls had gone over the previous 3 months. Now, I've done a piece up in The Guardian today, which if you get past the headline that doesn't quite capture it, is saying that we don't put the polling out because one of the reasons we don't put it out is it creates bad habits, including a sense of instability that things will move. The irony is, I think if we'd been putting the polling out over the last 6 months, there'd probably be a lot more stability on the opposition side, because the story really says that both with primary vote and two-party preferred, while the public's backing in the performance of government at both the federal and state level, it's not leading to voting intention. In fact, I think if we were going on the old formulation on these numbers, it looks to me like Labor would be ahead, maybe even 52-48 for what it's worth. Now, it is only worth a limited amount, but I think the insight we get from this, Catherine, and probably from the next couple of slides, is that the gloom and doom that because the government's gloom and doom on the Labor side of politics, that because the government is managing a public health crisis by doing its job, listening to experts, working collaboratively and putting money behind people to the extent they have, that doesn't win the vote. That just kind of wins appreciation, I guess.
Yeah. It's very interesting, this decoupling, and the quarterly data does underscore that. It underscores that obviously it's variable from fortnight to fortnight and presumably tied to issues, at least for engaged voters. But it does demonstrate that Labor has been competitive really through the back quarter of last year. And I think this fortnight are ahead. That's I haven't fluffed that, Peter, have I? They are ahead this fortnight. So
they are. Well, this is the 2PP, but we don't say ahead.
No.
Like, what's the right verb? That they're.
Well, this is the difficulty.
They've got a stronger base to build their election campaign off.
I just think we'll say they're in the hunt. I think that is the best way to describe it, and with all the caveats that you mentioned. Now, I encourage people to go and have a read of Peter's column today, which I did get time to read this morning. Sometimes when I come to these sessions, I haven't had time to read Peter's column, but I have this morning. And the point he makes about stability, much as it irks me, because I'm people who are regular in this session know I'm totally again the horse race, is actually correct. If, funnily enough, if the data was in the public domain over the last several weeks, I suspect the morale slump in Labor would be less than it currently is. But anyway, setting that to one side, the point we're making about this, though, is we are actually emphasising the caveats, right? They're in the hunt. But obviously there's a proportion of undecideds that range from, I don't know, about 6 to 9% in every survey. How those undecideds break obviously determines who gets over the line. That's the first caution, right? So they're in the hunt. How far they're in the hunt, well, we don't really know. The second kind of point to raise, and which gets back to this interesting decoupling, all the survey data, not just ours, over the last 12 months suggests that voters have given their governments, both state and federal, credit for, let's just call, competent management of a crisis, right? Like everybody, all the incumbents have got a benefit from that. We also need to remind each other and everybody here, Peter, that in every electoral contest last year that involved an incumbent perceived as competent, the incumbents won, right? So that's also a caution on how much we think Labor's in the contest here. But it is interesting, though, that that very, very consistent baseline of support for Scott Morrison throughout last year and the government's response, and also for the state premiers, is not necessarily something that the Prime Minister can bank. And that then takes us back to where I was and where Peter was a second ago, which is in framing the year, that there are a lot of uncertainties about this year, the economy, whether the vaccine program works, whether or not our governments will continue to present to the citizenry at large as competent, right? All that's a question at this point because of the variables that are outside Scott Morrison and others' immediate control.
Well, there's some that are outside his control, such as the global supply of vaccine.
Yeah.
There's some that are in, and I think the other one that we'll get to later is public expectation.
Yes.
But there's also a bunch of stuff that's inside his control, particularly around how fast, you used to call it the dismount, but how fast and what is the effect of winding back JobKeeper and critically JobSeeker. And I thought it was interesting that the messages now are coming out that there won't be a significant permanent increase in income support. If that is coupled up with increased unemployment when job seeker goes, that creates a self-inflicted problem for the government.
Well, that's, yeah, no, exactly, yeah, and thank you, because that's right. I shouldn't just present this as all being outside Morrison's control, because that point in terms of the fiscal, what would you call it, life support for individuals and the economy is completely within the government's control. The government
you could call it, or else you just call it the economics of crisis, and whether you try to rewrite the book, because it's clear that the economics of crisis demands government to invest behind its people. If you're ever going to do it, that's when you do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's right, and that's what we saw last year. The government is trying to, I suppose, step away. Not in a sort of ideological sense, but in a budgetary sense. They're trying to prepare Australians for the gradual withdrawal of support. And Pete mentioned job seeker, the old New Start before, because now the government's sort of messaging. I think the government's messaging over the last couple of days is sort of trying to set up a proposition that when the coronavirus supplement goes from the job seeker payment, that people shouldn't expect a massive increase in the base rate of New Start. I mean, I think they will raise the rate. I think they will, but the signalling is not by much. And again, that is within the government's control. Yeah. And again, whether now is the right time to be exiting fiscal support is very much an eye the beholder decision. But also, though, I think the government's form last year would tell us that if there's a genuine contest between, well, the government will spend. The government will spend. It did spend. If it thinks that it is substantively important to keep spending and also politically important to keep spending, they will. That was their form last year. I suspect that will remain the case this year, but obviously from its own base, the government is having to manage expectations about how large the debt is, how large the deficit is, when the fiscal repair program will start. There's a few variables here.
Yeah, and I guess that's the if you say you've got your vaccine rollout that's kind of outside your control, the economic approach, which is inside your control. The bit that probably sits in between those two is the behaviour of the rest of your team, both your sort of elder crazies, your Barnabys and your Christensens and your Kellys, and your young ideologues who want to rip apart the industry super system. How much of a challenge do you think all that is going to be to the PM?
Well, that's a helpful prompt. Thank you for it. That was one thing I didn't cover off in my press club wrap. The Prime Minister was pretty clear. I think that any call it reform, and that sort of relates to Pete's point about the ideologues in the government wanting to, thinking government is about something. You're a centre-right government. You're a Liberal Party. The Liberal Party has established values and propositions, and government must be about delivering those values and propositions. That's the cohort in the government who are saying, well, let's have a go at super, let's have a go at industrial relations reforms. We're a third-term government. We've actually got to do some stuff that is consistent with our philosophy. There's certainly a current of that in the government. I think Scott Morrison made it very clear at the press club yesterday that he himself is not that interested in reform in this 12 months because he's got his hands full managing a pandemic. And also, at the moment, I wrote a column about this last Saturday, or Saturday just gone. He's sort of in this big tent mode at the moment, in the sense that Morrison's trying to validate everything. He's trying to love everything at the same time, and not have fights, which is a bit of a shift from a Trump phase that he went through. Before the pandemic hit. We said last year, didn't we, Pete, that Morrison went through a phase of trying on a Trump suit. He's sort of come out of that phase, and now he's sort of in this I love you all, I love everything, as a mode of just sort of trying to hold this kind of centre ground that he wants to build. And if you go full bottle on some of these reforms, like IR or super, you create winners and losers. and your capacity to love everybody equally is eroded by your own actions, right? You make a choice. If you want to deregulate the labour market further, well, then you as a government are prioritising the interests of employers and business over workers. You can't just walk about saying you love everybody equally when by your own actions you don't. So anyway, Morrison sent a fairly strong signal, I think, yesterday that if reform involves fights with stakeholders that are going to cause political problems, then the government's going to be very modest in those areas about what it does.
So it really becomes the politics of governing, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Which, again, opens up the contest, because then you're going to be judged not on your big agenda, but by how you govern.
Yes. Which leads back to the uncertainties anyway.
It's interesting. Couple of areas where Labor's made big gains. John put this deck together. Why don't you, as our head geek, tell us what's happened here, John? We've got Labor's normally ahead with these two cohorts, but it's I think Morrison pared back over the last
yeah, what we're really trying to do, and as you, Catherine, have been discussing there, is talk more about the trends and looking back historically about what's happened and why it's happened, rather than the immediate and what's happening now. So what we did see, particularly since September and October, from the last time we showed these in these sessions, was there has been a slight movement increase from Labour. So what we can then do is look at some of the groups within that and see where that gain is coming from. So not necessarily Labour's key support areas, just where we're seeing some changes and increases.
Well, the wind back of New Start would make sense that there's going to be an impact on the views of people under 52K, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And what we can see with that household income chart on the right there is that even at points last year, the coalition was ahead on the 2PP of Labour. So whilst historically that might be a more Labour supporting cohort, what we're seeing is that did swing to the coalition earlier in the year, and at the minute it's looking like it's returning to more safer Labour results.
That's interesting, isn't it, Catherine? It's almost like that, and it sort of reinforces there have been groups who have clearly been in greater need, and I think they're two groups where they really needed government behind them. And as things wind back, that does have an impact on voting intention.
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, at the end of the day, voters make choices about, well, two things: what's in it for the country and what's in it for me. And if what's in it for me is less favourable, or that they think that there is an alternative on the political field who will offer them a better alternative, then you've got a contest rather than a sort of going through of the motions. And it's sort of like, you know, the best way to sort of understand this framing, I think, is that Morrison really wants the political contest for this year to be about, like to sort of put this sort of starkly, you know, the war's not over, kids, right? Like the war, we're still in the war. We've still got to manage these big, complicated crises and cross currents.
Yeah, because the crisis gives you the leave pass.
Well, that's right. It's sort of like the crisis. Well, the crisis does a number of things politically for Morrison. The crisis does a number of things. It keeps his own ideologues at bay in terms of their own reform aspirations. He can bat them off and just say, not now, kids, Dad, eat your peas. We need to get on with what's immediately before us. So that is helpful. It gives him the incumbency frame, which is obviously beneficial at the moment. If you are a competent incumbent, you win a contest, win an election contest. That's the lesson of last year. We had one incompetent who faced an election contest last year and he lost. His name's Donald Trump. So
he didn't lose, did he? I thought it was still disputed.
Oh, I know.
Oh, sorry.
Let's not do that. It's too soon. It's too soon. Anyway, so it's kind of the incumbency frame, right? And it keeps people focused sort of on here and now. Where Anthony Albanese wants the conversation to be is not like I'm the greatest pandemic manager, because obviously he hasn't been managing the pandemic. What he wants the conversation to be about is who will look after your interests best in the recovery and in the future. Like, who will make sure that this is fair? Who will make sure that some of the values that we've seen on display in Australia over the last 12 months are preserved into the future rather than just a transitory state of kumbaya, right? So that's where Albanese is trying to pitch the conversation, and that's what the year's about. Does he succeed in that or not?
And what's your take? And we're sort of doing the whole story rather than the slides. I might just come up for air for a second. We'll jump back into the other slides in a second. Otherwise you're looking at the same slide. Yeah. But so, you know, Labor, there seemed to be a whole bunch of angst over the summer. There's been a reshuffle. I don't know if it was reported as Albo's slogan is going to be on your side. I think it's more just an orientation. It's basically the theory that, you know, a lot of our political researchers always encourage progressive parties to talk about who you represent. Who's on your side is what I call the finger hut effect, which is an American polar big finger hut who I've spoken about regularly, who has this insight, which I still think holds in politics, that if you ask anyone in a Western democracy who's better at managing the economy, right of political parties win 60-40, regardless of how well the economy's going. If you ask the same group of people who's managing the economy for people like you, it goes back to about 55-45 to a progressive side. So it's obvious you've got to put people in the equation. For Labor, I do think the economic part of the story is probably where that puts people in the equation. I think also, if there are groups that need vaccines that miss out, that would the other opportunity. But it's almost like they've set themselves up for a race. I don't know. Do you believe and there's been a bit of skepticism in the chat I've seen as well about who should be leading the team, but have you got free advice to them?
Oh God, I would be the worst politician in this civilization. You know, do I have advice? Look, there's certainly the reason you're hearing chatter about Anthony Albanese's leadership predominantly is that the caucus has had a morale problem. They fear that people are still really traumatized and bruised by losing in 2019. That was an election Labor really thought it would win, and they lost. And it has been really difficult for a lot of people to come to terms with that loss. And then compounded by the fact the crisis has emerged, Scott Morrison has not cocked it up as he did with the bushfires. He's consolidated the government's position. Then people around Labor get to that sort of, you know, in their cups kind of punditry of, oh, does Anthony Albanese cut through? Is he a good foil for Morrison? Can he get Morrison by the throat? All of this sort of stuff. I mean, obviously that's a metaphor, not a real situation. No one is suggesting, right? Just to be clear. Anyway, so that's what's happened. In terms of leadership alternatives, obviously some people, particularly over the summer, have been positioning Tanya Plibersek, the most obvious one among a group. She is merely just putting herself at the front of the queue in the event that things change. Now, look, whether it's sort of both, it's as long as the caucus asks itself, can Anthony Albanese win, this will remain dangerous for the leader. That is the most dangerous question that a group of people can ask about their leader. Can you win, right? But it's also, I don't think there is agreement about what should be done to replace Albanese. You know, parts of the right, I don't think will cop Plibersek. If the leadership's open, there's a couple of right-wingers that might want it for themselves. So all of that has sort of then resulted in a whole lot of people kind of, you know, in a circle staring at one another, not really sure about what to do. Now, the way Albanese can sort of move past that dynamic is to obviously sharpen up, you know, get into the flow of the political year, set some parameters, you know, and I guess calm people's jitters by just sort of appearing to be in the fight. But he said, Albanese, last week after the reshuffle, that he wanted to be the Joe Biden of the Australian political contest that the guy who's sort of been around forever and underrated, and everyone's.
He's only got about 40 years to go, I reckon.
No, exactly. I know
Biden. Yeah.
it's not quite. It doesn't quite align for a few reasons. But anyway, the point was obvious, right? You're all underestimating me at the moment. You don't think I can win. Well, I freaking well can. And look, that guy did. So just, calm down was basically what Albanese was saying. So, anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying, look, if Albanese comes out of the gate hard, has a couple of good parliamentary weeks, I think things probably will taper off because there isn't unanimity about what an alternative strategy should be. And also, I think I was on Insiders on Sunday with Peter Harcher, and Harcher actually made some good points, I think, about the downsides of leadership changes within political movements. Now, Labor has tried to move away from the destruction it inflicted on itself through the Rudd-Gillard period. They have tried to be a different political movement, and that's the right decision. I don't think constant leadership changes, all that does, if we sort of look at the data about trust and about connection to institutions, all that does is just erode the trust of voters. So it's sort of like, anyway, I don't see myself. I think they should stick with Albanese. They should support him. I think that would be what most voters would think is the best idea, based on what we know about voters and their sentiment about leadership changes. But look,
you look at the history of opposition in Australia over the last couple of decades, and the number of times you have a structural problem in a party trying to be dealt with a change in personnel.
Yeah, exactly.
And it does more structural damage. So,
exactly.
I think.
It doesn't solve the fight. It doesn't solve the underlying kind of malaise. I mean, look, it's up to them what they do. And I really honestly, like, just to be clear, I hate that kind of punditry, political punditry from people in my position where you are, validating particular candidates. I mean, it's up to political movements who they choose to lead them. Honestly, it is.
And it really comes back to that finger hut formulation. If you're running on who's on your side, it doesn't really matter who your leader is if you get your political proposition right.
Exactly.
That's the bit that is often missed by all my colleagues who run much more creative advertising campaigns than I do. That said, Kevin 07 worked, but it also had rights of work behind it. So you actually had the framing being delivered by the union movement, and then Kevin was the glossy stuff at the end of it.
Well, and also we need to move on with facts, but also just with Rudd, he was benefited by the foil of John Howard, who was obviously a major, political figure for more than a decade, but was perceived by voters by the end as being, yesterday's man. That's a bit hard.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you for your service. We might need to hear from someone, we might need to hear from someone other than you. And part of Rudd's model for seizing that victory, apart from the dynamics you referenced, Pete, is that he was at pains to look kind of like
younger mini-me.
Except.
So let's go back to numbers, because I think this continues the conversation. If we have a principle that this year will be about the politics of governing, Labor is the party that believes in government. The Liberals traditionally believe that government should get out of the way. Now, I think in a crisis, they don't go there. And so part of, I think, that the battle of ideas in terms of the politics of governing, rather than having these grandiose future agendas, like what is the mechanics of having a state delivering for its people when they need them, health, coordination between the states.
Federation.
So let's sort of look at it through government, and governing has worked. Like, look at this. Even over summer when there were ups and downs, governing's worked in the States. No one's been running, and correct me if I'm wrong here, people. What's been remarkable is there hasn't been big privatization agendas over the last 18 months, or I think there's been businesses that have come effectively with outsourced models, but it's been more driven by need rather than directed by the government to undermine existing public services. So this has been a period where all states have benefited from that. Even over the summer, New South Wales down a few points. We had lockdowns over the summer. WA down from, you can't be down to 80%. That's just not.
It's kind of ludicrous. Oh my God, I'm down to 80%. What happens now?
Yeah. The last guy to worry about that was Lennon. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, Peter, it might be important to know we were in Phil just before the lockdown, which was announced from the government in there. So we just missed out on any effect that might have had on the
Thank you for injecting some accuracy into the discussion.
In fact, that's why John's here.
All right. So the other thing that there's a bit of chatter about is early federal election. People never like it. I think we were expecting that to be more firmly rebuffed than it was.
Well, I think that's a pretty sort of, look, it's not an 80% rebuff, but I think that's a pretty comprehensive rebuff. That's a pretty stick to your knitting, guys, sort of commentary from this sample, I think.
Because the one thing that comes with an election is politics, isn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly, which people don't want in the middle of a crisis. But it's also just on the early election, obviously. Look, governments go to elections when they think they can win.
Yeah,
that's the beginning and the end of it. I think if Morrison will always want to keep the option open of going to an election in the second half of this year, and perhaps he'll do it. But I think he is a Prime Minister that understands the downside risks of being seen to be a bit too clever by half. What am I saying here? Look, he wants the option open. I'm not convinced he'll choose it, but it's sort of a ridiculous kind of prediction, and I'm not actually predicting. I'm just musing. We can't determine here what he's likely to do in the second half of the year. But anyway, this is a bit of a stabilisation exercise. It demonstrates that, people during a crisis or even not during a crisis would just like the folks here to get on with something and not be, sort of endlessly having intrigues to improve their own position.
And, even that, it's interesting that more Labor voters and Green voters and coalitions want there to be an election.
Well,
yeah, I guess why wouldn't you? Anyway, the next slide. I thought this was interesting, Catherine. Who should be responsible for the distribution? If you're a coalition voter, you want the feds to be primarily responsible. If you're a Labor voter, you want the states to.
Yeah.
It is a grey area because it's kind of like I don't think vaccination is one of the clauses in the Constitution.
I don't know. Maybe if we've got a constitutional lawyer on today, they can tell us I'm wrong. But no, I think the Commonwealth is obviously spearheading the strategy, the rollout strategy, and presumably the states will get involved through hospital systems and through other public health services. So, it's sort of interesting, both the sort of, your partisan intention kind of forming your view about which tier of government is best. But I think if we combine this with the other vaccine questions that we asked,
that's a good prompt.
We get into we've been giving one another quite effective cues today, Pete. I think the sort of takeout from all of the vaccine questions is that the community has reasonably has expectations that this won't be a clustercast, which is sort of great. Like at one level, the government would say, pat itself on the back and say, oh, look, there's the competency dividend of the last 12 months, right? Like we've set up this proposition where people don't think we're idiots, right? They think that we can actually roll out a vaccination program. But getting back to where we started in the conversation, that then kind of brings in the variables, right? Like
whether it will actually be effective.
The curse of high expectations, call it that.
Well, yeah, I likened it. So they set a high bar, which becomes a rod for your back. So,
exactly.
If you show what competent government looks like, then people will probably want more of it.
Yes.
So
yeah, funny that people would want.
Yeah. Whereas I think part of Trump's strategy was not to show that it could be any better, and people expect it to be crap, and then it all falls apart. Go figure.
Yeah.
Well, we haven't even spoken about it. Let's not this time.
Yes,
So we expect it will be done efficiently. We expect it will be done safely. I'm interested amongst the other cohort of voters under 50% think it will be effective, and that probably is a little bit of anti-vaxxer territory there. If you're
and we've got to look at this, like we were resolved last year to look at vaccine hesitancy through the suite of data we collected last year, and I think we need to continue to do that. I think that's really important to understand that to the extent that we can. But also just on that, not sure that it's effective. There is the other cohort, right? Like obviously there's anti-vaxxer territory, but it's also in terms of the gradations in people's minds, it's kind of like, again, the sort of more helicopter takeout of these questions is, we think it's going to be safe. We think that the rollout's going to proceed effectively, but we're not entirely certain whether the vaccines are going to be, the thing that turns the tide. So that's how I interpret it. There's a hesitation on that last point. Are we really going to turn the tide?
And I think particularly with the perception of mutations coming now, which is kind of really concerning. And all right, which leads us into, and I think this is actually the biggest challenge for the government. People think things are going to be better. They don't think things are going to be worse than last year.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, and I think this is, so how do you look at the year after the worst year ever? Like, so does the year after the worst year ever get better? There's an expectation it will be better for the nation, for the economy. Line ball for the planet. And I think that talks into the way, the unresolved issues of thinking about climate.
Yeah, and the climate.
But also the personal ones are interesting because, there is a real scenario that, wind back the support too quickly and it may not be better for people personally.
Yeah, that's right. So there's sort of, again, like a part of the data sort of into this theme of today, which is the sort of curse of high expectations. And part of it sort of reflects a realism about, what can't be known about the next few months. So, how are things for you personally? Well, not entirely sure about that. That might be a function of income support. It might be a function of whether a vaccine works and whether I can get one, or whether, I get COVID or lose my job or whatever else, right? So that's sort of, that snapshot strikes me as pretty real. That sort of psychology looks rational to me. And in terms of climate, well, it just sort of indicates that climate's sort of creeping back onto the agenda after having a bit of a dormant period where, the sort of bulk of what Australians were worried about last year was, will I get COVID and will I still have a job at the end of it? It looks like climate's kind of creeping back slightly into the kind of zeitgeist.
And if that is the case, how do you read Morrison's kind of broad 0 by 2050 aspiration yesterday, and also the decisions Labor's made around climate over the last week or two, Catherine?
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting. And it's hard for somebody who's followed this debate for as long as I have to have any kind of optimism in it at all. But anyway, let's try optimism for a moment and see how that fits. I think, look, the government's sort of at an interesting crossroads because they're sort of contemplating, I guess, whether or not you can continue to weaponize this issue in order to win elections, or whether you start to be damaged by that weaponization that they have done basically religiously over the past decade. So Scott Morrison's working out whether he can get to making a concrete net zero by 2050 commitment before the next election without the Nats basically severing the coalition or his own, sort of science deniers having some sort of explosion like we have seen in recent years. So he's just trying to weigh a number of different calculations. In terms of Labor, well, it's a bit frustrating to this extent. I think Labor has actually spoken about climate change as an economic issue for the best part of a decade. I don't think that's been an also ran. But what there is a change in emphasis, I think, now with how Chris Bowen wants to frame this issue. He wants to sort of take climate out of the realm of great moral challenge of our time, which sort of makes it an artifact of belief, makes climate change.
Yeah, it's almost becomes identity politics rather than class politics,
exactly.
Which Labor can never win.
Exactly. So he wants to pull it over into materialism, which I think is absolutely the right call. He wants to, make climate change about your future. I.e., do you have one in terms of the jobs and prospects, and also safety, obviously, from the dangerous impacts and effects of climate change. So I do think this is the right framing. And I think Labor will be hoping that Morrison gives them a bit of a fillip by sort of turning this issue a couple of degrees away from weaponisation. But
yeah, you can't see him coming into Parliament with another lump of coal over the next year, can you?
No. He's definitely trying to set up a shift. Whether or not he can land it is not. I'm quite uncertain about. And also, we just need to, as well as sort of the theatre criticism about his words, right? Like, will he make a concrete commitment about net zero or not? That is important. Language and that framing is really important, particularly in this country where this debate has been so debased. So many lies have been told in this debate. Like, if we have a period of sanity in the language, that will actually make a material difference. But at the same time, we need to be very clear that Morrison is talking rhetorically about a shift in position. Net zero by 2050. Oh yeah, I'm not against that. I'm totally for it, except brackets if I have to actually sign up to it. And also, we need to be very clear that all of the coalition's current policies in this space are not working towards that end. There is a substance gap here between saying I'm for net zero by 2050, meanwhile having a gas-led recovery and other things. It's kind of like back to...
You're not saying he could put a slogan ahead of substance, are you, Catherine?
Well,
it's so cynical down in Canberra.
Certainly not. I'm not saying that at all. But it's back to this big tent strategy where Morrison's trying to validate everything. He loves everything. He loves renewables. He loves coal. He loves gas. He loves Barnaby Joyce. He loves Trent Zimmerman. He loves them all. It's all God's children, except climate actually does require you to make choices. If you are literally going to take action that sort of removes the worst case scenarios associated with uncontrolled warming, and if you are going to set Australia up for an economic future that does not involve our entire economy being configured around carbon intensive exports, you actually have to do something. You have to make a choice. You can't love it all. You've got to love some things. So anyway, we'll see if the Prime Minister can bring himself to love some things over the course of the next 12 months.
Yeah. Look, finally, the other thing that's happening that's kind of my passion project and dragged me right in over the summer, Google and Facebook threatening to pull news services in Facebook's case and all search in Google's case. It will, if they go through on this, and from where I sit, they're backing themselves into a corner. That's going to be a political disruption of some significance. And I haven't even really begun to think in my mind how that plays out, because at the moment you've got all sides of politics backing in the news bargaining code, which will be obviously to the benefit of The Guardian, also to Rupert Murdoch. It's working its way through the parliamentary process. I actually got to address my first ever Senate committee yesterday, Catherine, although it was very easy doing it from my home Zoom office. It was very comfortable. I think I would have been crapping myself if I was actually down there.
You might have had to put on a tie or something,
Yeah, I don't have one anymore. However, when they say that Morrison's got no reform agenda, there is a big digital reform agenda coming through that isn't just the media code, it's privacy, so your data privacy rights, it's disinformation. So there's a bit going on there, and it is weird that it's being driven by this side of politics. But I don't know how do you think that's going to play? Because I'm too close to it now.
No. Well, and I obviously just the Guardian does have a commercial interest, obviously, in this code proceeding. I'm not, just to be clear, and so that I've disclosed all of any issues to this audience. I'm not involved in any of the Guardian's conversations about how this code lands or not. In fact, we maintain a strict separation between church and state in our organisation. I've got no idea what we're doing, but I can just make the obvious point that we are benefited in the event that that the platforms are put in a position where they have to actually give companies like mainstream media companies fair compensation for the distribution of content. Anyway, with that disclosure up
But
front,
beyond the policy, you've watched a fair few political fights. This will be a significant one if it
this is a
goes
really
to the
big
next level.
deal. This is a really big deal. First thing, I'll validate your point, Peter. The government has been genuinely gutsy taking this on because it's not a consequence-free proposition. I think once people understand that Google may withdraw its search function from Australia if they go ahead with that threat, that is quite a significant political proposition to manage. There's a lot of stakeholders from consumers through to businesses who will be deeply alarmed by that development. And the government's cracking hardy at the moment about Microsoft will bring in Bing and everything will be fine. Try and sort of disentangle Google from your life and you'll find it's a bit more complicated than you might think. So anyway, setting that to one side, and we don't know, obviously, if the platforms will follow through on this threat, but we do know that this legislation that's making its way through the political system at the moment is a world first. It is being watched by competition regulators and parliaments elsewhere. We know that the platforms who are facing major risks, particularly in their home jurisdiction of the United States, antitrust actions, other things coming down the pipe, we will know that the platforms will move heaven and earth to try and cripple this code in Australia, because if this succeeds here, then obviously other jurisdictions may follow suit. And these guys don't like regulation. They like to move fast, break things and make profits. And if there's got to be a more equal set of circumstances, then that is obviously not beneficial for the platforms, even though it's happening in a small jurisdiction. What the platforms will be worried about is whether this shifts into Europe and shifts into the United States. So anyway, it's a big deal. It's serious. I think there's
and look, there's rightful skepticism in the chat about backing in something that will benefit Murdoch. I just think on this one, it wouldn't be moving forward without Murdoch. The realpolitik of it is, but it is significant. And if we can create some regulatory frameworks that start with the media but move into data and disinformation, then I think we are doing something to make our democracy more resilient, which is really why I'm loading into it in a big way.
Well, exactly. This is about this whole play is about democracy. It is about the future of democracy and who has a voice in it, and whether sort of mainstream media outlets who are devoted to facts, evidence, and truth are able to function with all of the disruption to our industry through technology and other things. So it's this is a really important piece of policy, and it'll be. And so far, the political system, government, Labor, Greens, everyone's holding firm around this concept. But I think things will get really choppy, as the platform.
Yeah, well, it's always the way with reforms. It's only when it hits the end point, and there could be a flurry. Particularly, Google last week started running experiments where they removed news from some people's search. So if they go postal to use a different technology, it will be very interesting. Hey, we're winding up the hour. I've been a very, very poor MC and have not called anyone up to ask questions today. However, we'll get a bit more interactive when we've got less to talk about in a couple of weeks' time. We're going in the field next Monday. I said a couple of queries or suggestions in the chat that we look at political donations, John. I know that I think there was a data drop of some of the donations just the other day. Catherine, anything else you're curious about at the moment that we should start thinking about?
Well, I think like we did vaccine questions obviously this fortnight, but I think hesitancy we need to get back into. We need to work out where that is sitting along the spectrum of voters. I think that's really important.
Yeah, in a way, it's the condition precedent from things going back to normal. So understanding the drivers of that, I think, are really important.
Yeah, it is important. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Cool. Let's give ourselves an early mark, but that's great. Good to see everyone again after the summer, guys. And I think we're back this Friday. We're launching Digital Rights Watch's annual report for those that want to go deeper into those technology debates. And I can assure you our friends at Digital Rights Watch aren't on the same page as me, so that will be quite interesting. But everyone look after yourself, and we'll enjoy Parliament. Catherine, jump into question time. I think you've got 20 minutes and it's on.
Oh, no, I've got like literally 2 minutes.
Oh, well, you go now.
Yes, better go.
Farewell. All good, everyone. Thank you. Cheers.